All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Diana Chu. I'm a compliance officer at the Canadian Audiovisual Certification Office, aka CAVCO, and I'd like to welcome you to this one-stop business workshop. If you had previously joined us for the live session on tax credits, explaining the point system, what grinds, and what is assistance, you may recall that we had some technical difficulties. Well, that is all fixed now, and we have Katya Preto back to talk to us about points and assistance and to address some questions that were sent in. Katya has worked at CAVCO since 2010, where she has occupied many different roles, including Senior Tax Credit Officer, Quality Assurance Officer, and now in her current role as Policy Analyst. And it's so wonderful to have her back and present to us again. Before we begin, Katya and I would like to acknowledge that we're presenting to you on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Since land acknowledgements are specific to each region, we encourage you to visit the Native Land Visual website to identify the First Nations territories on which you're located. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Katya.
Thanks, Diana. So today we're going to take a look at the point system for the CPTC, and we're also going to look at assistance. So we can start with the first slide. So the point system. The point system is one of several eligibility requirements for the CPTC. 6 out of 10 points are required for production to be eligible for the CPTC, except for treaty co-productions and documentaries. Points are given for key creative positions that are occupied by either Canadian citizens or permanent residents. And if there's no one that's filling a specific function, then that function is not counted towards the total number of points that are given for a production. So for example, if there is no music composer in a production, then that production will be counted out of 9 points instead of out of 10 points. And so 9 out of 9 points for a production is actually considered the same or equivalent to 10 out of 10 points. And we can go to the next slide. There is something that's known as a documentary exception. So for documentaries, specifically points for documentaries, if a documentary production does not have lead performers or other positions such as art director or music composer, it can still meet the key creative point requirement with less than 6 points, as long as all filled positions are held by Canadian citizens or permanent residents. For example, a documentary can be certified as 5 out of 5, but not 4 out of 5. It's important to note that this exception is only for documentaries. So documentaries are the only productions that are allowed to be certified with less than 6 points. And we can go to the next slide. So there are two key creative point scales. There's one for live action and there's one for animation. So first we're going to take a look at the live action production point scale. On the left of the table, you'll see all of the key creative positions that CAVCO evaluates and the number of points that each position is accorded, and the total of the points is always 10 for both of the point scales. So for live action productions, CAVCO will evaluate director, screenwriter, lead performer with the highest remuneration, lead performer with the second highest remuneration, director of photography, art director, music composer, and picture editor. So those positions will all receive either 2 points for director and screenwriter, or the rest will all receive 1 point. There are some specific positions that are mandatory. So director and screenwriter, those positions must be filled, at least one of them must be filled by a Canadian. So what that means is that for a production to be eligible for the CPTC, it must receive either the 2 points for director or the 2 points for screenwriter. If neither of those positions are occupied by Canadians, then the production won't be eligible. There's a similar requirement for lead performer. So for a production to be eligible for the CPTC, either the lead performer with the highest remuneration or the lead performer with the second highest remuneration must be Canadian. There's a really good section in the CPTC application guidelines that discusses how CAVCO evaluates lead performers. So I would suggest consulting that if you have questions or concerns about how lead performers would be ranked for your specific production. So now we can move on to the animation point scale on the next slide. So you'll see that most of the positions are similar, but there are some differences. At the bottom of the table, you'll see that there are some positions that are actually linked to location. So the positions for animation, director, screenwriter, and storyboard supervisor Lead voice with the highest or second highest remuneration. For that position, it's actually 1 point that's given for either or. Design supervisor, camera operator, if the work is done in Canada, music composer, and picture editor. All of those key creative positions receive 1 point. So some of the information that's important to note for the animation production point scale specifically, the camera operator point is only given if the work is done in Canada, as there are some mandatory points just like live action. So firstly, either the director or the principal screenwriter and storyboard supervisor must be Canadian. So if neither of those positions is occupied by a Canadian, then the production would not be eligible. And the lead voice point, so either the highest remunerated lead voice or the second highest remunerated lead voice must be Canadian in order for an animation production to be eligible for the CPTC. And there are also some specific requirements for the location-based points, being that the key animation must occur in Canada for the production to be eligible. That point for key animation is mandatory. So we can go to the next slide where we're going to discuss some other information. So CAVCO IDs or CAVCO personnel numbers are how individuals demonstrate that they're a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident. So individuals to obtain a CAVCO ID must apply to CAVCO. They'll submit an application to CAVCO, and they also have to submit a copy of their proof of citizenship or permanent residency. And there's a specific list of proofs of citizenship or permanent residency that CAVCO accepts. That's available on our website if you want to consult that. So it's an individual's responsibility to apply for a CAVCO ID, but only individuals who occupy key creative or producer-related positions actually need a CAVCO ID, and those are the positions that you saw listed on the previous slides, or anyone who's receiving a producer-related position. We can go to the next slide. So here are some rules to keep in mind for how CAVCO evaluates key creative positions. So firstly, regardless of the specific title or credit that an individual receives, the head individual or individuals for each department are the ones that CAVCO considers when allotting the related points. So here are some examples. If a production is giving the credit of technical director or lighting director, but there's no director of photography listed, those positions of technical director or lighting director might be considered the equivalent of a DOP, and so those positions could receive the director of photography point. Similarly, for the art department, if somebody's receiving the credit of production designers, and that's the head of the art department for that production, then that person could receive the point for art director. So there's no point that's given if a key creative position is shared with one or more non-Canadians. So if there are multiple people performing the same function and receiving the same credits, then all of those individuals have to be Canadian in order for the point to be accorded. And we can go to the next slide. So some more things to keep in mind for evaluating key creative positions. So for a series with multiple episodes, each episode of a series is actually considered a separate production. So it has to qualify on its own merit and receive each episode must receive the minimum number of points in order for that episode to be eligible for the CPTC, and CAVCO episodically for series. So the screenwriter points, there's two criteria, one of which must be met for the screenwriter points to be accorded. So either, for a live action, either everybody who's involved in the preparation of script material for the production, in other words, everybody, including the writers, showrunners, story editors, story consultants, any credit that's associated with or that's performing the function of preparing script material that's involved in any of the stages from development to outline, different treatments and polishes to the final shooting script, they must be Canadian. Or if that criteria is not fulfilled, the points can be given if the principal screenwriter is Canadian and the screenplay for the production is based on a work that's authored by a Canadian and is published in Canada. So we can go to the next slide here. So now we're going to begin the second part of the presentation where we're going to discuss assistance. This is also commonly known as the grind by people. So we can go to the next slide. What is assistance? Essentially, assistance is any type of production financing received from public or private Canadian or foreign sources in the form of a grant, a subsidy, a provincial tax credit, a forgivable loan, or any similar type of funding. The most important thing for the purpose of calculating the CPTC tax credit estimate is to know whether a source of funding is assistance or not, because assistance lowers the cap on the maximum amount of labor expenditure that can be claimed on a production. It grinds the cap. Applicants must report any assistance that has been received or is anticipated to be received at the time that they submit an application to CAVCO, but it's actually the CRA during their review of a CPTC claim that has the final authority to determine whether a source of funding is assistance or not. So CAVCO will make its best determination based on all of the documentation that's provided at the time of application, but it's CRA that has the final authority for that. And we can go to the next slide. So here's a really helpful table. One of the most common questions that I get asked at CAVCO is whether a specific source of funding is assistance or not. So this is in general. So generally, these are some amounts that are considered assistance and are not assistance, but it really always depends on the nature of the agreement. But in general, government equity, funding from federal, provincial, municipal governments, or public authorities like crown corporations or crown agencies are considered assistance. Forgivable loans, provincial tax credits, grants, the Canada Media Fund, any financing from the Canada Media Fund other than license fee top-ups, labor deferrals, other deferrals, Eurimage funding, and lastly, crowdfunding. And there's an asterisk there because for crowdfunding, CAVCO will always treat it as a rule as assistance when they review an application, but it's CRA that has the final authority, and they might determine that some forms of crowdfunding are not assistance when they review a tax credit claim, but it's the CRA that will determine that because CAVCO only issues an estimate of the CPTC. And on the right, you'll see some examples of funding that are generally not considered assistance. So any broadcast license fee, whether domestic or foreign, doesn't matter, that's generally not considered assistance. Any advances or minimum guarantees from distributors, Canadian or foreign, those are not considered assistance. Bona fide loans are not considered assistance. As I said, license fee top-ups from CMS, from the Canada Media Fund, are not considered assistance. Gap financing, private equity, for example, Rogers Cable Network Fund, that's not considered assistance. Share purchases, operating capital, and lastly, sponsorship. So those are examples of funding that are not considered assistance in general. And we can go to the next slide. So it looks confusing, but I promise it's not. Here's an example of a financing scenario for the CPTC, just to illustrate how assistance kind of plays into the tax credit estimate. So here's an example of a production that has a budget of $335,000. And on the left, you'll see there's the financing for that production. And the amounts that are bolded are the amounts that CAVCO has determined to be assistance. So we have a provincial tax credit for $100,000, some deferrals for $10,000, and some services or facilities in kind for $5,000. So in the review of an application, those amounts were considered to be assistance, and they total $115,000. So in the calculation, you'll see that $115,000 is deducted from the total production cost, and that's the grind. So that's what's reducing the cap. And for this reason, the tax credit estimate is calculated as $33,000. So this is an easy way to see how various sources of assistance will grind or reduce the net production cost and ultimately the eligible production cost, and will have a direct role in how the CPTC estimate is calculated. So that's actually the end of the presentation, but there's a couple things I just wanted to note before I finish. Firstly, that if you're a new producer or if you've never applied to CAVCO before, or even if you have, one of the best resources that's available is the CPTC application guidelines. They were recently updated, and it's a great place to look for information. I've only covered some of the basic eligibility requirements for the CPTC, but I really suggest taking a look at that because everything is explained in detail. And secondly, if you take a look at the guidelines and you have any further questions, or even if you have questions about a specific production, I always suggest that you call or email CAVCO. We're always happy to answer any questions that you have or point you in the right direction of information that's available to help you understand the CPTC program or the PSTC program. Feel free to contact us.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Katya. Yes, we have a lot of our colleagues available who are more than happy to help. We'll just continue on with some questions for this session. We'll start with some points question. So if a production is a live action animation, a combination of both animation and live action, how would the points work?
So for productions that have a combination of both live action and animation, CAVCO will take a look at the production and typically reviewing the DVD or the production and determine what the majority of the format is. So if a production is a combination of both, but the majority is live action, like 80% live action, then CAVCO will use the live action point scales to evaluate the key creative points for production, and vice versa. If a production is mostly animation, but it has some live action elements, CAVCO will use the animation point scale to evaluate the key creative points. So it depends on what the majority of the format is for those combination productions.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. Does a Canadian citizen who lives in the US and pays taxes in the US, would they still be eligible to be a Canadian key creative?
Yes. So for the points, the key creative points, the requirement is that an individual is either a Canadian or a permanent resident. So if somebody is a Canadian and they have a CAVCO ID, as long as they have that CAVCO ID and they're Canadian, it doesn't matter where they live and where they pay taxes, they'll always be considered a Canadian for the purpose of the key creative points, regardless of where they live, the point will be given.
Okay, perfect, awesome. Now, if we have a Canadian who is occupying multiple key creative roles. For example, there's the same person in the lead performer role and the writer role. How would the points work then there in that situation?
So that's definitely not uncommon for somebody to wear multiple hats in a production, and it doesn't really affect the points at all because the points are linked to the role that's being performed, the function that's being performed. If an individual is performing multiple functions, as long as they're Canadian or a permanent resident, they'll receive a point or 2 points for each related function. So the points are given for the function, not the individual. An individual can be performing every single function, every single key creative point role, and they can still receive each of the related points.
Oh, awesome. Can a point be given for the subject of a documentary or someone who gets interviewed a lot? For instance, if a documentary is about our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is a point given for him as a lead performer, or is a point only given for a documentary's host or a narrator? I'm not even sure if Justin Trudeau would get a CAVCO ID, but anyway, so don't mind answering that.
That's a great question. So for biographical documentaries, subjects of biographical documentaries are not considered to be lead performers. So in this example, if it was a documentary about Justin Trudeau and his life, he would not be considered a lead performer for CAVCO. And interviewees also are not considered to be lead performers. For documentaries, there are some rules that CAVCO uses to evaluate lead performers. So a host or a narrator of a documentary could be considered a lead performer, but it really depends on the scale of their role. So if it's a narrator who is substantially advancing the storyline and they're not just, making brief introductions between segments or something, then yeah, they could be considered a lead performer. There's a really good section in the guidelines actually that explains how CAVCO evaluates lead performers for nonfiction productions, because they can be structured a bit differently than fiction productions, where it might be a little harder to determine who a lead performer is, because they might not typically be considered to be performing, but they're still considered lead performers for CAVCO's purposes.
Okay, well, I think that's a yes. Check the guidelines out. Lots of good information there. Next, you addressed part of this question already, but we do get this question quite a bit. How are screenwriter points affected by screen adaptations of other works, for example, books or plays? If a Canadian screenwriter adapts a work written by a non-Canadian, do they still get the point? And the second part of this question is, what about shared writing credits if a writing team work together is made of Canadian and a non-Canadian writer? So that second part, I think you've already addressed it, but we do get that quite a bit. So we don't.
Yes, yeah. So if the production is based on an adaptation of a work that was authored by a non-Canadian, the point can still be given as long as everybody who is performing the preparation of the screen material is Canadian after the concept has been acquired by the production company. So that's something that CAVCO will look at when they evaluate productions that are based on acquired, or based on adaptations of non-Canadian screenplays or material. They'll evaluate the amount of work that's done after and whether it's being done fully by Canadians to determine whether the points can be given. And to address the second part of the question, yes. So in order for the point for screenwriter to be given, if the writing credit is being shared by multiple people, every individual who is sharing the credit or performing different, even if they're not shared, if they're screenwriting credits, and anyone who's preparing for material has to be Canadian for the screenwriter points to be given.
Okay. And that's just the two. So you can have multiple people, but everybody needs to be Canadian to even get that 2 points. You can't just use one person to get that 2 points.
No, exactly. Yeah.
And one more question here for points. So once you apply for a CAVCO ID, is it valid in perpetuity, or do you need to reapply after a certain amount of time or for certain projects?
So that depends. If you're a Canadian citizen and you apply for a CAVCO ID, that is your CAVCO ID for life. It will never change. CAVCO IDs for permanent residents, they always actually begin with the number 0. So permanent residents will have to always reapply when their permanent residency expires and they get a new permanent resident card. They will have, not reapply, sorry, they'll have to send CAVCO a new copy of their updated permanent resident card. And it's that individual's responsibility to contact CAVCO to update their CAVCO ID. For example, if a permanent resident becomes Canadian, they would have to reapply and they'll get a CAVCO ID that demonstrates that they're Canadian, and that CAVCO ID will never have to be updated. And that sometimes happens too, so.
Okay. All right, so we're gonna move on to some fun questions about funding and assistance now. What are the characteristics and criteria of a bona fide loan, and can you please give some examples?
So a bona fide loan is a loan that has repayment requirements. So the loan agreement would typically have a repayment date or a demand date or language that indicates that the loan must be repaid. So if a loan agreement doesn't have any language or is not required to be repaid, then CAVCO will consider it to be a forgivable loan because it's given outright with no expectation of repayment.
Okay. Let's see here. For small productions, where filmmakers occupying many roles, wearing many different hats, usually the filmmakers are last to be paid. There's often a need for all the financing to come in, including tax credits, before the filmmaker can fully be paid. For the money not yet paid out by the time one applies for CAVCO certification, how does one distinguish between deferral versus purchase order, such as work done will be paid but not till tax credits come in?
So if I understand the question correctly, if a person in a production is agreeing to defer a portion or all of their fees for a production until a later date, then that's typically considered a deferral because it's an amount that's contingent on a future event, so the production earning revenue, and typically that would be considered a deferral. I always like to remind applicants that it really depends on the specific nature of the agreement. So if you have a specific agreement or arrangement and you want to contact CAVCO to discuss that, we could do that. But in general, an amount that's agreed to be deferred until a later date would be considered a deferral. If an amount is deferred, but it's repaid after a certificate is issued, an applicant can contact CRA, and CRA might change that decision to treat it as non-assistance, but that's something that's handled by CRA when they review a tax credit claim.
Okay, good to know that CRA can still have some leniency after the fact. Okay, I'll still speak on the financing topic. Does my production have to be fully financed when I apply to CAVCO for the CPTC?
So yes, when an applicant is ready to submit an application to CAVCO for the CPTC, CAVCO expects that the production is fully financed. It doesn't have to be complete, but the financing has to be all in place. And an applicant has to be ready and able to send all of the agreements related to the sources of financing in their application.
Okay. And then, so then if the production is fully financed, but all the sources of financing end up being considered as assistance, does that mean that they won't get a tax credit, or is there still any point for them to apply for the CPTC?
So typically, if the sources of assistance exceed or are equal to the total production cost, the tax credit estimate will be zero. And whether they want to apply to CAVCO is really for their own, that's their decision to make. One of the reasons to apply to CAVCO is obviously for the tax credit, but CAVCO also issues like certificates of Canadian, it's considered CanCon, Canadian content. But if an individual is not expecting to receive a tax credit because their assistance is so large, they can also apply to CRTC to get CanCon certification. So it's really a personal decision whether they would still want to apply if they would expect that their tax credit would be severely reduced or zero because of the amount of assistance for their production. Okay,
good to know. So CAVCO is not the only way to get the CanCon certification. There's also CRTC. But with CAVCO, you can get a tax credit if it's not all funded by assistance or.
Okay. Yeah, exactly.
And I think we have time for we'll just have one more question. If I won a web series pitch competition, which includes winning in cash and in kind. So say like half of it's in cash, and then like 5,000 is in cash and 5,000 is in camera equipment. Would the $10,000 be considered assistance?
So yes, both of those amounts would be treated as assistance. Firstly, the first amount, the cash prize, would be treated as assistance because it's given outright. So it's just given with there's no expectation of return or anything. So amounts that are given outright, it's generally considered almost like a grant. So that amount would be considered assistance. And the second portion, any amount that's given like services or in kind, is treated similarly. So it would not be counted for the purpose of calculating the tax credit.
All right. Okay. So I think we're going to end it here, but I know that there were some more questions that were sent in. And so in that case, please visit the CBC Business and Rights website, where we'll have some of those questions and answers posted up for you to follow up. Thanks again, Katya, for coming back and answering all these questions for us. Thanks to the organizers for putting together this opportunity to re-record this session for you guys. And for everyone at home, thank you for coming back and giving us another chance. We hope you found the session useful, and have a great day. Bye.
Bye.